Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. This is Season 6, Episode 12. Today I'm talking to author Jonathan Kauffman, who wrote the book Hippie Food. I was so happy to be able to talk with Jonathan. I've read his work in numerous publications, not the least of which are many of the San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle weeklies I've read. You've seen his work in Lucky Peach, Eating Well, Men's Health, and other publications. His book Hippie Food really got my attention with the various historical topics that came up in the work. His book looks at the way the 60s health movement changed the way we eat today. I'm going to now go right to my conversation with Jonathan Kauffman, author of Hippie Food. Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. My name is Dean Jones. I'm your host. Today, my guest on the program is Jonathan Kauffman. He is an award-winning writer and editor based in Portland, Oregon. He is the author of Hippie Food, a history of brown rice, tofu, whole wheat bread, and granola in America, as well as A Place is a Gift newsletter about cooking in the neighborhood. Jonathan, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
I really enjoyed getting a chance to read Hippie Food. It was just as a history and food nerd and somebody who kind of lived through some of it, it was just really exciting for me. And I imagine it was really exciting to write. I also, read some of your work online and in print as well. So I really am happy to have you on the program. Thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, in my research, I saw that you were described as you were from a lentil-loving Mennonite family in northern Indiana from the 70s. Can we talk about your youth growing up in Indiana and how it influenced your later career?
Sure. Yeah, my parents were, so I grew up Mennonite. My parents, my family's been Mennonite for generations. And there are two main cultural centers for Mennonite culture and sort of organizations in America. And one is in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and the second is in Elkhart County, Indiana. And my parents moved there to go to what is now sort of the probably the most liberal, intellectually minded of the Mennonite colleges, and stayed in the area. And so I grew up immersed in Mennonite world, but my parents were also on the sort of the far progressive end of the spectrum. And so, they came of age in the 60s and 70s. And so there were a lot of people I grew up with were involved in political movements, especially the peace movement. My family, my parents' generation had ditched the covering and a lot of the much more conservative beliefs of their parents' generation, especially growing up in rural areas. And so there were a lot of elements of Mennonite culture that were sustained. Focus on community, focus on peace and nonviolence, a focus on community service, but some of the other external trappings and the sort of isolation, the cultural isolation, they had really abandoned. So in some ways, what that did is, as my career sort of progressed on, was left me with this enduring sense that both the world was bigger than anything I'd ever grown up with, but also that writing can perform a service. Writing can be of service to the community, and not just sort of the community of food lovers, but the broader community that can sort of delve deeper beyond kind of received ideas of what a restaurant should be.
That sounds wonderful. Now, you mentioned all the political things too. Was there kind of a health food focus in Mennonite culture as well?
So I wouldn't call it health food so much, but in 1976, there was this book called More with Less that came out, and it was definitely inspired, very openly inspired by Francis Moore Lappé's Diet for a Small Planet. And
yeah,
but what it did was it sort of shifted into a Mennonite context, and so many of the recipes were contributed by people who had done relief work around the world, and so there was a real global focus of the recipes, but they were all also really focused around this idea that faith should involve stewardship of the earth, and so we had to use the earth's resources more lightly, and that meant also adopting a lot of these raw foods and or not raw foods but whole foods and what were health foods that were circulating around the counterculture. So it was these sort of brown, earthy recipes with a lot of international flavors.
It was a weird time back in the 70s because I remember like for 1 minute we were all sitting eating almost everything was synthetic, it was Tang, something called space food sticks I remember eating that were, I don't even know what the hell it was. And just a lot of stuff that was very prefab. And then overnight, it seems like we're eating granola, sprouts, plain yogurt. It was insane.
Yeah. I think, yeah, kids today have no idea what a radical shift this was, and how sort of foreign it was to mainstream culture, but also, just sort of how much was being worked out in that period about what, if we're going to eat a certain way, how should we eat? I swear I remember my mother getting rid of the Velveeta from our fridge, and she cannot remember that moment. But I mean, it must have happened around when Diet for a Small Planet and More with Less came out.
I remember my mom read the Sugar Blues, and that was the sign of doom in our household.
Well, yeah, we weren't allowed. After a certain point, we weren't allowed sugared cereals, but we were allowed honey. And
Yeah.
so we would have Cheerios, and like I would dump on as much honey as that I could manage before my mom turned around and looked at me. So we found ways around it.
Now, you were cooking for a few years in kitchens as a line cook in Minnesota and San Francisco. Can we talk about that and some of the places you worked?
Yeah. So when I had no thought of cooking. In fact, I was kind of a picky eater. But then I went to Belgium as an exchange student and right before college, and kind of discovered a whole world of food I had no idea existed. And then when I was a freshman in college, some of my friends started working at this restaurant called Table of Contents in St. Paul, that was in a bookstore next to the college. And they were doing, really progressive stuff with, now, I mean, it's like with balsamic vinegar and with sheep's milk cheese and making their own sausage and things that now are sort of like ha 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 ha, but then were kind of revolutionary. And they needed a dishwasher one day, and I decided to be a dishwasher for a while, and then I became a prep cook there. And then I moved out to San Francisco and after college, and decided, I temped for a while and decided, I really want to learn how to cook. And so I started cooking in restaurants, and cooked for a few years. Restaurants that are sort of like higher end bistros, doing some more creative fare, sort of California French food. And then decided that I didn't want my entire life to circle around a restaurant. I wanted to have a bigger life than working 60 to 80 hours a week in the kitchen.
Now, as a veteran of the kitchen who's worked at different stations there, did you read Kitchen Confidential by Bourdain, and was it revelatory to you, or did you feel like you'd been there too, like a veteran wrote about it as well?
It was funny. Like I remember even before Confidential came out, I was cooking when his first essay came out in the New Yorker, and so I subscribed to the New Yorker. And in my head while we were working, I was like, I don't feel like anybody's ever captured this kind of chaotic energy of the kitchen. And I'd sort of play around with ideas of how I would write that. And his essay came out, and I was like, oh, everything was there, and it was so much. He was so much better than I could have even imagined writing. So yeah, I was a big fan of Bourdain.
Now, you ultimately left the kitchen and became a journalist, and you were able to review restaurants for 11 years in the Bay Area and Seattle for the East Bay Express, Seattle Weekly, SF Weekly as well. You wrote about food trends and profiled chefs. What was that period like for you?
I think I think it's kids of today. It's important to like put the alt weeklies that I was working in context, because I think they really don't exist beyond maybe the LA Weekly and a few other papers that are down to a few slim pages. They're not what they were in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
The alt weeklies were these free alt weeklies were a force. They were fat newspapers that you would pick up on the street, and because there wasn't the internet, that's where you would go to look for listings, for cultural criticism, for advertisements for rock and roll shows, and so they really invested a lot in food coverage. But the food coverage that we did in the alt weeklies was slightly different from the daily newspapers in two ways. And one was that it was really focused on both talking about the tiny restaurants and the expensive restaurants in the same terms. Partly because we just didn't have the budgets of the big newspapers, but partly it was an aesthetic, it was a intellectual, almost an ethical choice. So we covered sort of all of those little restaurants, but then also we focused on voice. The reporting for alt weeklies was rigorous, but it was also it was very focused on the tone, the voice, the color of the writing. Whereas at the time, daily newspapers were much more focused on objectivity. And so it was such a pleasure to learn to write and to be a journalist and to be a restaurant critic for the alt weeklies, because I had complete creative freedom. And so I sort of observed anonymity. But in the same way that the daily newspaper critics did. But I could focus on like a taco truck one day and on a 5-course tasting menu the next. And I loved that juxtaposition, and I loved what talking about both of those kinds of restaurants in the same tone said about the broader city. I felt like I was writing, instead of just writing for the rich people, I was writing for everybody and the way that all of my friends were eating.
Well, it's really true because, when I moved to the Bay Area in the 90s, I had left San Diego, whose weeklies were pretty phenomenal. And then I came to the Bay Area and it was even better. There was all these different weeklies we could read, and they were so very essential to us. And you're right. I mean, the food writing in there, among other types of writing, was just phenomenal. And it really tipped on to the culture of food here. And it gave you a lot of info about, like, you were able to find out, the pulse of food in the Bay Area. And it was so essential. And the food writers were like rock stars. It was so cool to get to read different things. I mean, like you said, I don't think people really get it, like who now get everything on the internet. It was all we had, really.
Yeah, and because those publications were all supported by ads. They were free publications. When print ads died away, especially the classifieds, it just the alt weeklies collapsed.
Yeah, I remember that time. I was working in a newspaper at the time, and it was, everything kind of turned really quickly.
Yes, it did. Yeah, I feel like in between the time I was 30 and started and when I was 40, probably at least half, if not 2/3 of the staff jobs disappeared in food writing.
Yeah, I remember, like, one week it seemed everybody was jolly and happy, and then the next week all the suits are frowning and everybody was saying no more parties, no more this or that.
Yeah.
Your first book, as we mentioned, is Hippie Food: How Back to the Landers, Long Hairs, and Revolutionaries Changed the Way We Eat. This was published in 2018. I read this before I ever talked to you, and just, I really loved it. I got it when I saw it available in the library. I just snatched it up immediately because this looks really great, and I wasn't disappointed. It's jam packed. I mean, it's like if you were to visualize an overstuffed trunk or suitcase stuffed to the gills and like brimming with stuff, it's like that. It's got so much in there. It's just amazing, because as a history lover and a food lover, it's got everything you could possibly want. Where did the impetus to write this come from for you?
It took several different forms. It sort of marinated for about 5 years before I really decided I was going to actually go for it. So the one of the moments that sort of where it crystallized that there was something there I needed to investigate was when I was doing a restaurant review in Seattle, of a vegetarian restaurant that had been around since the 1970s. And I went with a couple of my friends who were the same age. And, I was like, oh, I'm going to do this because, I don't know, it'll be fun, whatever. I think they have, some nut loaves and stuff. And I haven't really covered them. And I went, and all three of us at the table had this like moment of deep recognition and nostalgia at this sort of, these like chunky vegetables that were steamed and covered in lemon tahini sauce and soy burgers. And it was like, and all of a sudden I started thinking, well, this is food that I have been around all my life. And I have no idea where it came from, let alone why, Mennonites in a small city in Indiana were cooking this food. And so I thought, and also this food is disappearing. So I was first trying to like at least just do some kind of character profiles of the people of these restaurants that were still around and this cuisine that was disappearing, that was so formative for me. And then I started thinking, well, actually, I need to do some sort of like culinary etymology of it. I'm curious about where it came from, and also how it got to Indiana. And so that's when I thought, oh, I think there's a book here. And it wasn't until I had left restaurant reviewing and I had a little more time on my hands that I decided to start researching it. And then it took about 2 years to even kind of come up with a proposal. And because the two things I wanted to figure out where all of these different foods of my youth came from. And two, I knew that this was such a period where people were living in such, creative, untraditional, kooky ways. And I knew that there were a bajillion stories out there. And I wanted to capture the flavor of the time through the stories of the people who were involved in this movement.
Now, I'm going to ask this question, and it may seem like a no-brainer, but I purposely asked this because of the content in the book, because I thought it was so well written. So for our listeners who are not familiar with the term, can you tell us what a hippie is and where did the term come from?
Well, what I had no idea when I started researching this book was how controversial it still was for baby boomers. So hippie is, we sort of, I think there's this sort of loose idea of what a hippie is that's filtered out into, the pop culture of the 2020s. And it's long-haired baby boomers, who are all about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and had their flared bell-bottom jeans and their, the greasy hair and the psychedelic shirts and, peace, love, whatever. I grew up with, folks who had bell-bottom jeans and long hair, but they were all involved in social justice movements, and, food was something they were taking very seriously. And as I did this research and I talked to so many baby boomers of that time, I would use the word hippie because that's what my Generation X, used to sort of describe this food, hippie food. And they would like, oh, hold on, I wasn't a hippie. Because hippie in that time was so stigmatized in the same way that I think hipster was, last decade. Yeah. It was this sort of like this pejorative, and the phrase that they, it was dirty hippie. Right. And so there were this unwashed, libidinous, masses of kids who were going to, bring down society. And so all of these kids were like, oh, I'm not a hippie. I'm part of the counterculture.
Now, you write about a group in the book that I really enjoyed reading about, and that's a local kind of group, the Diggers. Can you talk about them a bit?
Yeah, I fell in love with the Diggers. Well, many groups I fell in love with while researching this book. But the Diggers, so we talk about the Summer of Love in San Francisco in 1967, and so that term was sort of popularized by Timothy Leary the summer before, and he sort of blithely invited all of the teenagers of the world to come to San Francisco and tune in, turn on, drop out. But the Upper Haight District of San Francisco had, for about 3-4 years before that, had sort of developed this more organically, this tiny scene that grew out of control. That was like, folks who kind of created the aesthetic, were doing massive amounts of psychedelics, and living communally, sort of living as cheaply as possible. And the Diggers, so the Diggers came out of a political theater group, the San Francisco Meme Troupe. And they were doing political theater, and then realized, partly because of this sort of being part of this psychedelic culture, that that there was something beyond, beyond politics, right? That something was happening, and there were these massive shifts in consciousness that people in the Haight were having, because of the drugs they were doing. But this idea that, you had to break away from the social structures and the ideas of the past, and so they could use theater to kind of help people have these realizations. So they started passing around tracts, and they started, they invented the phrase, "Today is the first day of your life," which now is like a cliche, but then was sort of something like, this idea. And so they were really committed to the idea of it was sort of it was anarchist principles. They didn't have a leader. They had a few sort of folks who were kind of coming up with the ideology, but they were really interested in the idea of free. So they had a free store where they set up a store where it was like anybody could do, like little free libraries. Anybody could drop off goods, and you could come in and pick up anything you wanted. They started serving food in the Panhandle, Golden Gate Park, free food, and you would have to. It was really designed to make sure they were feeding all of these kids who were flooding into the Haight for the summer love, finding places for them to sleep and eat. And so they started cooking stew and serving in the park. And they had this giant empty rectangle that they called the free frame of reference. And so in order to, if you could show up with a bowl and a spoon, but in order to get to the stew, you had to walk through the free frame of reference to realize that everything was free. So they were both. They would sort of criticize the consumerist aspects of the hip culture that was happening, but they would also sort of do all of this like impromptu anarchic social work to support this community, as this counterculture community that was developing. And then they eventually faded out.
I love reading about the digger bread and coffee cans.
Right, so that's right. And so after they started cooking a stew, then somebody showed up and said, "Hey, I want to teach you all how to make bread. So we should add bread with the stew." And so this engineer from somewhere, down on the peninsula showed up, and he brought all of these coffee cans and taught them how to make whole wheat bread. Because like people weren't really talking that much about whole wheat bread, but if it was going to be bread, it was going to be good, healthy bread. So they started. They found a kitchen in the basement of a church that was willing to let them bake bread, and so they would bake these, cylindrical loaves of whole wheat bread in coffee tins, and then bring them to the park to slice and hand out as well.
This episode of the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast is sponsored by the Culinary Historians of Northern California, a Bay Area educational group dedicated to the study of food, drink, and culture in human history. To learn more about this organization and their work, please visit the website at www.chnorcal.org. Now, you wrote about something else you touched on, and I really was interested in it because it's a term I hear all the time. Even nowadays we hear it, but I don't think anybody really knows what the hell it means. And it was really gratifying to see you write about it, was macrobiotics.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about that a
Yeah.
little bit?
Yeah, and in fact, so I'd heard sort of vaguely the term macrobiotics before I started doing my research, but as I was working on the book proposal, I decided that I would first start looking at brown rice. And so I went and talked to some 80-year-old rice growers in California, and about how they got started farming organically and selling brown rice. And they said basically, well, we couldn't have done it without the macrobiotics. And I was like, there was a macrobiotic community. So macrobiotics, I got fascinated with, and it was this movement that was founded by a man named George Osawa, a Japanese man, who he participated in this health food movement in Japan that was very fringe, that was devoted to erasing the impact of Western diet and, refined sugars, refined flours, sort of tropical sweets, things like that. And he combined it with this sort of slapdash interpretation of traditional Chinese medicine and ideas around yin and yang in the body and how they needed to be balanced out in the body, and that would have ripple effects, out in the universe. And he traveled around the world and ended up, having a small following in New York and California. And these folks had this very austere diet that was focused on brown rice. They had what they recommended, what they call a 10-day brown rice fast, where you would eat nothing but brown rice and a little bit of miso soup, just for a little bit of liquid. And if you did that for 10 days, it would sort of change all of the atoms in your body and balance out the yin and yang. And then if you adopted this a slightly less austere diet that was all vegetables and maybe a little fish and brown rice, you would sort of bring your body into alignment with the universe. And so this diet sort of existed on the fringes in the early 60s, but then the counterculture kids gravitated toward it because it had this sort of world-changing aspect to it. It had these spiritual overtones, but also it kind of melded with this critique they were developing about industrial food and about refined flours, refined sugars, plastic food found in cans, and so these counterculture followers ended up becoming macrobiotic and then sort of preaching the gospel of this new diet across the country, particularly in Boston and California. And it ended up becoming the template for the hippie food, what I call hippie food, that developed later on in the 1970s.
Weren't people like dying from it, or like malnutrition?
Yeah, in the early days, because the counterculture kids were so, they took this idea of a brown rice fast and they rolled hard with it. And so it kind of activated some folks, food. It activated some folks, what's the term? Food. I'll need to redo this.
It's okay.
What's the term? Like food dysfunctional food eating.
Yeah.
Sorry. For the counterculture kids, like it activated some of their disordered eating patterns. And so there were folks who became strict macrobiotic, which was really, anorexic, and they became so malnourished because their diet was so narrow and low in protein, probably, that some folks developed scurvy because vitamin C, sugar, citrus fruits were too yin. Some people died from malnutrition. It really took a couple of the followers of George Osawa to sort of step back and say, hey, okay, whoa.
Yeah.
Loosen up just a little bit. And here's a standard macrobiotic diet that you need to follow it. And this brown rice fast thing, not so much.
The research in the book, the bibliography is extensive. What was it like doing the research for this?
Well, every step of it was a delight. I mean, really, I don't think I have and will ever embark on a project as fun as this one. But because I wanted to tell all of these stories through, so I wanted to talk about this history through the personal stories of people involved. I wanted to combine oral history and document history. And so I looked at sort of secondary sources to get a sense of, people analyzing what had happened for background. But really, it was a combination of primary sources. In fact, a lot of underground newspapers, the alt weeklies that I ended up working for, combined, that were sort of, that I would weave together with interviews of folks to put together this story, and a lot of cookbooks as well. And so what I would do with each chapter was try and locate a community with a really interesting story around the topic I was looking at. And I wanted them to be all over the country because it was a hard sell when I was selling the book to New York, who thought that, oh, this is a Bay Area thing. This isn't a national story. And I was like, well, I grew up in Indiana eating this food. It's a national story.
Yeah.
So it was really important for me to go to Minneapolis and Vermont and Austin, Texas, and and San Francisco and Seattle, and paint this broader picture of a grassroots movement.
Now, your book concentrates on three types of food ideology: health food fadism, ethical vegetarianism, and the post-Silent Spring critique of industrialized food and farming. I referenced Silent Spring because that was a really huge book at the time that really kind of opened our eyes to food additives, pesticides, and things like that. So I want to ask you, in doing the research for this and writing this book, did anything kind of knock you over or kind of change your POV?
Yeah, a lot did. I mean, I think when I went into it, I had a sense that I wanted to talk about organic farmers and I wanted to talk to the food co-op movement. I didn't know that much about them, but I wanted to know more about where they came from. But I didn't have a sense of this health food movement and how far back it went in the American sort of how far back it has been a sort of a countercultural element in American thinking around food, but also like how kooky some of these ideas were that sort of gave birth to foods that I took for granted. Like there's this sort of this element of willingness that Americans have had to believe anybody with a good story about why we should be eating something, whether it's a spiritual story, whether it's about nutrition, and if it captures our imagination, we will follow it to the point of malnutrition. And so like tracing all of these different threads, all of these different movements, whether it was macrobiotics or the 18th century vegetarianism of Sylvester Graham, who was kind of the first vegetarian prophet, but was telling us that we shouldn't eat, refined wheat or meat because they would overexcite the senses and that we would sort of tumble into illness because our bodies were so sort of inflamed by excitement. All of these different theories that have that have existed below the surface, and they may have been mocked the entire time, but yet there were these kernels of wisdom that kind of popped up from them, and these foods that were adopted, whether sprouts or granola, that then kind of filtered their way into the mainstream with no memory whatsoever of how weird the reason why we should be eating them was.
You had a chapter in the book that I really, really liked. And I liked it mostly because I really didn't have any idea about it. And I had friends and people that I had talked to who touched on it. But this was the back to the land organic farming movement of the 60s, which you talked about, which I think you kind of grew up and were part of. There were a lot of people that were moving to the South or the Midwest to buy farms and go back to the land. I was talking to Crescent Dragon Wagon. She actually had gone to Arkansas to do that. And she wrote a book, I think a commune book. And then I talked to Susie Cigarette, an author who's written some books about Appalachian food. And she talked about how she was raised in that too. Can we talk about this a little bit? Because I really think it's just a hugely palpable part of the book.
Mm-hmm. So I knew I wanted to write about back to the landers because I'd heard that term, but it wasn't until I started doing some research into folks who had done, there's some academic research into the scope and the impact of the back to the land movement, that I realized how big it was. That, starting in the late 1970s and late 1960s and all through the 70s, there was a massive out migration of young people from cities and smaller cities to rural areas. You can see it in the census reports.
Yeah.
Like it was the only and biggest spike in in growth of the urban populations, in a 150-year period. So these kids young adults were really caught up in the idea that there was a disillusionment with the politics of the time, the fact that their protesting and their activism was not having an effect on who was president, and that the opposition was so fierce they kind of they decided that if we can't change the political landscape of America, we're going to create a new society, and when the revolution happens and the country disintegrates, we will have created these new communities that will then be able to sustain the new better America. And so they moved into communes, and they moved into homesteads, and they built log cabins, and they moved into areas where land was cheap and they could get to, and the areas that were emptying out. And they started, then they got there and they were like, oh God, how do we feed ourselves? So these folks with all these sort of Western they'd grown up on Westerns, they had this sort of fantasy of and I should specify that almost all of these were white folks. This is a white American movement because rural America was still so hostile, in 1970 to Black folks and folks of color, that it was this sort of, there was this like, we want to recapture the great American past with erasing the history of slavery and the impacts on the long-term impacts on Black American communities. So these white kids, these white middle-class kids, moved into these log cabins and communes, and then they tried to figure out how they were going to make a living and how they were even going to feed themselves, by opting out of plastic America. And so they began farming. And they began looking at organic farming, which was this theory that had come out of Britain in the 1930s, 1940s. And there was this one magazine called Organic Farming and Gardening, published by the Rodale family, which now has the Rodale Institute. And it was all about creating compost and opting out of chemicals. And so they formed these networks, these rural networks of farmers, young farmers who were devoted to using these principles. And they ended up creating, teaching themselves how to farm, interacting with the local farming communities and converting some of the old timers, and creating what we know as the organic agricultural marketplace today.
I think what you touched on with them getting along with the locals was the one thing that surprised me the most, because I've lived in rural communities and I don't always find them to be very welcoming to outsiders. And in here, talking about basically these young hippies moving in and kind of like being different and them welcoming that did that surprise you too?
Yeah, it took a while though. Like if you look at the, in Vermont, which is the community I looked at, for just to sort of have to anchor the story in a lived experience. There were all these articles about the hippies are coming. The hippies are coming. There was a moral panic that was spread by the newspapers about all of these. They thought they were going to like bring the VD and the drugs, and certainly there were some very chaotic, hedonistic communities that formed. But the folks who lasted, a lot of the folks, these young, strong folks were moving to rural areas that had been emptied out, where like a generation of young people had left for the cities for better economic opportunities. And so the older people who were left needed help, like, harvesting corn or rebuilding structures. And you had all these folks who wanted to make a little money, learn from the old timers, they didn't want to use the big industrial equipment, so they wanted to use the sort of the old farming equipment and figure out how to do it. So they developed these relationships with their neighbors that ended up being very supportive, mutually supportive. I think it took about, it seems like it took about 10 years, but then a lot of those communities really accepted the counterculture kids.
I remember there was some movies back in the 70s, the Billy Jack movies with Tom McLaughlin, who became a senator later, and they always had these communes where the locals would give the kids a hard time, on their commune, and there'd always be a conflict, and Billy Jack would rescue the commune members.
Mm-hmm.
You have a chapter that spans the beginnings of co-ops onward to modern Whole Food stores. That was really heady reading because it wasn't always easy, and sometimes there's a lot of acrimony and strife. Can we talk about this a little bit?
Mm-hmm. So I grew up in we had a small commune in Elkhart, Indiana, and that's sort of where I grew up after school, with my mom weighing cheese and hanging out among the bins of oats and unbleached wheat. And so I knew I wanted to write about the co-ops. And the co-ops ended up being the mechanism by which I was looking for the story of how hippie food made it out into the mainstream, and the co-ops were the mechanism by which that ended up happening, because all of these little buying clubs and tiny operations where they were going to where they wanted to secure all of these these whole foods, these very strange foods. They erupted all over, I think more than 5,000 across the country, and all of them most of them were organized around anti-capitalist ideals. So the idea was, not only are we creating a new society, we're creating a new economy, and this economy is going to be people-centered, food for people, not for profit. It wasn't going to be it wasn't going to be organized on making anybody rich. And so you had all of these folks who gathered together. They committed a little bit of money financially. They had to put in labor, free labor, and they would maintain these sort of ramshackle stores where they would have all of everything sold in bulk. And they were what happened at that time, though, was that they were organized by the people, they belonged to the people, and so any kind of strife that arose in the communities was going to get hashed out in all of these very long meetings. And whether that was talking about whether bananas were ethical to stock, or whether that meant that they were the entire focus of the co-op was too off-putting to the working class. It was too focused on the counterculture, and so we needed to really rethink what we were doing. And so these communities, there were co-op wars even in Minnesota over sort of political ideology, but they also sprung up at a time, at the last great period of food inflation in the United States in the mid 1970s. And so people were looking for ways to eat more cheaply. And here were these co-ops run by volunteers where they could keep the food prices down. And so you have brought in a lot of people who did not really want to have much to do with long-haired, smelly hippie types, to shop for all of these foods, and discovered all of these new foods that they had never heard of before. So.
I want to ask you, what has been some of the responses you've gotten from the book, from the people that are in the book? Because you've written about a lot of people. Have you got any feedback from anybody that's one of the people mentioned?
There was only one person who complained, and he his name is Samuel Kamen. He was the founder of he was in his 80s when I talked to him. He's the founder of Stonyfield Farms, yogurt, and an organic pioneer in Vermont. And he was angry at me because I titled the book Hippie Food, because he thought that hippies that was a mischaracterization of his generation, or the people he worked with. But I think there was for a lot of baby boomers I talked to, a lot of counterculture baby boomers, I would call up all these people and be like, I have this odd question. I talked to this guy who says that you know something about this little commune that you lived in, or you were part of this restaurant. And it was this way of, it was this thing that they had done in the 70s and had forgotten about. And here was somebody who was helping them make sense of what this movement was, and saying, look at how much influence you had on the way we eat today. Like, look at the change that your bizarre, not very tasty diet in 1970 has wrought on the entire American diet. So I think a lot of baby boomers appreciated that. And I also hear a lot of folks from my generation who were raised on this, who had it forced upon us, who who have, and who had childhoods that were really marked by this difference from the mainstream, because they were eating food that was really repellent to their peers, and they were mocked for it. And they were like, oh my God, I remember this, and oh, this is where this came from. And for the same impulse that I had, which was this like, oh, this is my own history, and I didn't know it.
So, Jonathan, I want to ask you, what's next for you?
I'm figuring it out still. The pandemic, the
Oh, yeah.
pandemic. No, I write for national publications. Sometimes about food. Sometimes I've been writing here and there about AIDS and the impact of the AIDS on my generation as well. And I'm doing this newsletter where I moved to Portland 2 years ago, just right before the pandemic, and have been trying to find ways to get to know a city without interacting with the city. And so I have been embarking on all these little projects to cook and eat my neighborhood. And so some of that's foraging, some of that's gleaning, some of that's gardening, and I just wanted a forum to write about all that stuff. So that's a place is a gift, the newsletter.
I'll put a link to that and the book on the bio. Jonathan, I really want to thank you for being on the program, and I want to thank you for your book, because Hippie Food is a hell of a read, and I really recommend it to anybody listening today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being on the program.
Yeah, it was a delight.
That was my conversation with author Jonathan Kauffman. You can buy his book, Hippie Food, at all better bookstores and online. We have links to his website and book on the bio. On Monday, we'll be having British food writer, cookery book author, and recipe developer Catherine Phipps on the program to talk about her books Modern Pressure Cooking and the separate books Leaf, Citrus, and Chicken, respectively. She'll be on our program on Monday. On Friday, we'll be having Bay Area food and lifestyle photographer Erin Scott on our program to talk about her career. Follow the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast on Spotify or iTunes and get notified when new episodes are released. You can subscribe to the podcast newsletter and get updates on my articles and more at the link in the bio. Our podcast theme song, Talk About Love, is sung by the band Kitty Cat Fan Club. Their label, Asian Man Records, has been given permission for its use of the song. You can check them out and order records or t-shirts and check out other bands on the website at asianmanrecords.com. Link also in the bio. Until next week, I hope you all have a really wonderful weekend and have some really wonderful things to cook. See you then.
I've been getting better than